The freezing air in the cabin was so cold it burned her lungs with every desperate breath. Sarah Abbott fought against the ropes. They bit into her wrists, tearing at skin that was already raw and bleeding. Outside, a full-blown Montana blizzard screamed like a ghost, rattling the single window frame with every gust. The world was a whirlwind of white and fury. Inside, it was a tomb of shadows. An old oil lamp on a rickety table was the only light. Its flame danced and flickered, throwing long, monstrous shapes across the rough-hewn walls. The drafts seeping through the cracks made the shadows move as if they were alive. Sarah squeezed her eyes shut. She tried to slow her heart, which was hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She'd survived Boston. She'd survived the whispers, the judgment, the cold shoulders of high society. Surely she could survive this. But the thought was a lie, and she knew it. The wind moaned, the timbers of the old hunter's cabin creaked, and a cold dread seeped into her bones that had nothing to do with the temperature. And that's when she heard it. Footsteps, crunching through the deep snow. Heavy, deliberate. They were coming closer. The sound cut through the howl of the storm like a razor. Sarah's breath hitched in her throat. Her blood turned to ice. No one should be out in this. No one sane. Only someone desperate, or someone dangerous. The footsteps stopped right at the door. For a moment, there was a terrible, suffocating silence. The only sound in the world was the frantic pounding of her own heart. Then the door blew open. It didn't swing. It exploded inwards, bringing a vortex of snow and wind and biting cold into the small room. The lamp flame guttered wildly, almost going out. A silhouette filled the doorway. It was massive, a giant of a man, broad-shouldered and impossibly tall, his face lost in the shadow. And in his hand, something gleamed in the flickering lamplight. It was the curved blade of an axe. Sarah stared up at the towering figure, her mind blank with terror. Her entire life, everything she'd been, everything she'd hoped for, had come down to this single final moment. Her fate was sealed, reflected in the cold, hard steel of the axe. But this nightmare didn't start in a blizzard. It started 2 months earlier, with the warm, comforting smell of fresh bread. The Wilkins Bakery was Sarah's sanctuary. The rich scent of sourdough and cinnamon and baked apples was a shield against the life she'd left behind. After 3 years in Timberline, Montana, this little shop was the only place she truly felt safe. "Those look perfect, dear," Margaret Wilkins said. Her hands, weathered and wise, worked a ball of dough with a rhythm born from 60 years of practice. "Thank you, Mrs. Wilkins." Sarah tucked a stray piece of auburn hair back under her cap, her precise Boston accent a stark contrast to the rustic sounds of the bakery. It was a ghost of her old life she couldn't quite shake. The bell above the door jingled, and Sheriff Patterson stepped inside, stamping snow from his boots. "Morning, Mrs. Wilkins." "Miss Abbott." "Sheriff, your usual?" Sarah reached for a loaf of the crusty rye he liked. "Please, and one of those cinnamon rolls for my wife." He leaned on the counter, his gaze drifting to the town hall across the street. "Big meeting today. That railroad proposal's got everyone stirred up." "Changes seem to follow the railroad wherever it goes," Sarah said, wrapping his bread in brown paper. "That they do," the sheriff agreed. He took the package, but then he paused. "Say, I heard Tommy Miller's fever broke last night. Doc Wilson is calling it a miracle." Margaret nodded, a knowing look in her eye. "Sarah took some of her chicken soup over to the Millers yesterday." The sheriff looked at Sarah, a strange curiosity in his gaze. "Well, whatever you put in that soup, Miss Abbott, Tommy's mother is calling it a gift from heaven." After he left, Margaret turned to Sarah, her expression serious. "That's the 3rd time this month. Someone gets sick, you cook for them, and they make a sudden recovery." Sarah kept her eyes down, kneading a fresh batch of dough. "It's just a coincidence, Mrs. Wilkins. Nothing more." "Is it?" The old woman's voice was soft, but it carried a weight that made Sarah look up. "In my time on the frontier, I've seen things that can't be explained. Things some might call gifts." "I wouldn't call it a gift," Sarah whispered, the words barely audible. Margaret placed a flour-dusted hand on her arm. "A burden, then?" Sarah finally met her gaze. In the old woman's eyes there was no judgment, only a deep, unsettling understanding. "When I cook for someone," Sarah confessed, the secret tumbling out of her for the first time. Sometime I see things, glimpses. What might happen to them? The visions had started after William died, her fiancé, lost at Gettysburg. The grief had broken something inside her, and this strange, unwelcome ability had seeped into the cracks. I can't change what I see, she said, her voice trembling slightly. I can only watch. And Tommy Miller? Margaret asked gently. What did you see for him? A tiny, fragile smile touched Sarah's lips. I saw him running through a field of wildflowers, laughing. Next summer. Margaret just nodded and went back to her dough. She didn't ask any more questions, and that was why Sarah had found peace in Timberline. Here she could almost pretend to be normal. She could bake her bread, keep her secrets, and mourn William in the quiet moments. Lieutenant William Kingsley, his laughing eyes, his love of poetry, his certainty that the Union cause was just. He'd promised her a life of books and music and children. He'd promised to come back. Instead, a letter came, and then the visions, and the guilt. The terrible, crushing guilt that she was alive, and he was not. Sarah, Margaret's voice pulled her back to the present. Would you mind delivering the Peterson order? My old joints are aching something fierce. Of course, Sarah welcomed the distraction. The Peterson farm was on the edge of town, near the foothills where the deep forest began its climb into the mountains. The crisp October air was a welcome shock to her senses, clearing her head as she walked the rutted dirt road, a basket of pies and bread on her arm. After dropping off the order, she decided to take the long way back, a path that led past the town cemetery. She was drawn to the small section where the town's fallen soldiers were buried. It was a quiet place, the silence broken only by the whisper of the wind through the pines. She was reading the names on the simple stone markers when she realized she wasn't alone. In the farthest corner of the cemetery, a man stood before a single, solitary grave. He was a massive figure. His shoulders were so broad they seemed to block out the mountains behind him. His sheer size was almost mythical. Sarah froze. She knew who it was. Everyone in Timberline knew of him. Ezra Blackwood, the mountain man, the giant. The stories they told about him in town were the stuff of nightmares. They said he'd been a surgeon in the war, but the things he'd seen had shattered his mind. They said he'd married a Cheyenne woman who died under mysterious circumstances. They whispered that he was a monster, a killer who lived like an animal in the high peaks. But what Sarah saw wasn't a monster. He stood with his head bowed, a small bouquet of wildflowers clutched in one massive hand. His stillness was profound, a study in grief. It was the posture of a man praying or a man saying goodbye. She tried to slip away unnoticed, but her boots snapped a dry twig. The sound cracked through the silence like a rifle shot. Ezra Blackwood's head shot up. His eyes, even from a distance, locked onto hers. The intensity of his gaze was a physical force. It pinned her to the spot. For a long, breathless moment, neither of them moved. Then he gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. It was a gesture of acknowledgement, not threat. And then he turned and strode away, vanishing into the tree line with a grace that seemed impossible for a man of his size. Sarah let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Her curiosity, stronger than her fear, pulled her toward the grave he had been visiting. The headstone was simple, worn by the harsh Montana weather. Morning Star Blackwood, beloved wife, 1843, 1878. His Cheyenne wife. The voice came from right behind her. Sarah spun around, her heart leaping into her throat. It was Dr. Wilson, the town doctor, holding a bouquet of his own. I didn't mean to intrude, she stammered. No intrusion, the doctor said kindly. He had a gentle face, etched with the lines of a man who had seen too much, but hadn't let it harden him. He nodded toward the grave. Morning Star was a remarkable woman, a healer. She helped me deliver half the babies in this town. The town? They talk about her death, Sarah said, hesitating. They say Ezra. Dr. Wilson's expression turned to stone. People fear what they don't understand. Morning Star died from the same fever that took a dozen others that winter. Ezra nearly killed himself trying to save her. He used every bit of medical knowledge he had. He was a doctor? Sarah asked, surprised. The town stories never mentioned that. One of the finest battlefield surgeons in the Union Army, Wilson said, his eyes growing distant. We served together at Antietam. He could save men that other doctors had already given up for dead. He was a miracle worker. But the stories, they say a man died at his cabin. Ezra defended his wife, Wilson said, his voice hard. Some local thugs got drunk and decided to pay the Indian lover a visit. One of them didn't make it home. The other one started spreading stories, painting Ezra as a monster. And the stories grew. Sarah thought of the way Ezra had stood at the grave, so full of sorrow. That doesn't sound like a monster. No, the doctor agreed. But it's easier to fear a giant than to understand a man in pain. As Sarah walked back to town, the doctor's words echoed in her mind. A new kind of curiosity had taken root. She found herself taking a detour, following a faint trail that led up into the foothills, in the direction of Ezra Blackwood's cabin. She knew it was foolish. She knew she should be afraid. But something compelled her forward. The trail climbed higher, winding through stands of golden aspen and dark pines. Just as she was about to turn back, she heard it. Music. It was piano music, drifting through the trees like a ghost from another life. The haunting, melancholy notes of Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata. It was William's favorite piece. The sound pulled her forward, an invisible thread tugging at her heart. She followed it around a bend in the trail and stopped dead. There in a small clearing was a cabin. It was larger than she'd imagined, solidly built with a stone chimney puffing a thin ribbon of smoke into the autumn air. The music was flowing from an open window. It was played with such profound sadness, such raw feeling, that it brought tears to her eyes. She stood there mesmerized until the final, heartbreaking chord faded into the mountain silence. Only then did her eyes fall on an axe, its blade embedded deep in a chopping stump near the door. The handle was worn smooth from use. An impulse she couldn't explain, a force she couldn't resist, drew her toward it. Her heart was pounding, a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She reached out, her fingers trembling. The moment her skin touched the worn wooden handle, the vision hit her. It wasn't a glimpse. It was an explosion. A battlefield. Bodies everywhere. The air thick with the stench of gunpowder and death. A surgeon's tent, filled with the moans of wounded men. And there, at a blood-soaked operating table, was Ezra Blackwood. Younger, his face grim, working frantically under the dim light of a lantern. On the table lay a Union lieutenant. He was pale, his uniform dark with blood. It was William. Sarah saw it all through Ezra's eyes. She felt his desperation, the slipping of William's life through his skilled fingers. And she heard it. She heard William's last words, whispered with his final, ragged breath. "Tell Sarah, I'll love her beyond the stars." Sarah ripped her hand away from the axe, a choked gasp tearing from her throat. She stumbled backwards, falling to the ground, the world spinning around her. The vision was gone, but the truth it left behind was a brand on her soul. Ezra Blackwood, the town monster, the hermit, the giant. He was the man who had held her fiancé's life in his hands. He was the man who had heard William's last message, a message he had never delivered. She couldn't confront him. Not yet. The shock was too great, the revelation too raw. Instead, she fled back to the safety of the bakery, her mind a whirlwind of confusion and grief, and a strange, unsettling new emotion she couldn't name. She had to know more. She had to understand. So she started a silent conversation. Once a week, she would walk to the edge of his property and leave a small basket. Fresh sourdough, a jar of honey butter, maybe an apple pie. She never left a note, never signed her name. But she had a feeling he knew. A few days after her first delivery, she found something on the bakery's back step. It was a small, exquisitely carved wooden bird, its wings outstretched as if in mid-flight. The detail was breathtaking. A week later, she left a basket with cinnamon rolls. She found a carved flower on her step, its petals so delicate and realistic, she could almost smell its phantom scent. This strange, silent exchange continued for weeks. A basket of food for a masterpiece of carving. The last one he left was a tiny piano, no bigger than her palm. The keys were so perfectly carved that they actually moved when she touched them. Margaret watched it all with a knowing silence. But the town started to notice. "Heard you've been leaving food for the mountain man," Sheriff Patterson said one morning, his tone casual but his eyes sharp. "He's a neighbor," Sarah replied, her voice even. "It's common courtesy." "Just be careful, Miss Abbott," the sheriff warned. "A man like that, alone for so long, he's not like us." "Civility isn't something you forget, Sheriff," she said with a polite smile that ended the conversation. "It's just something you rarely encounter." What she didn't tell him was that this silent exchange was healing a part of her she thought was dead forever. The simple act of reaching out to this broken, misunderstood man was easing the loneliness that had been her constant companion since William's death. She wondered if Ezra felt it too. Then the storm that had been brewing on the horizon finally hit Timberline. The town hall was packed for the meeting about the railroad. Mayor Jeremiah Cole was practically vibrating with excitement as he laid out the proposal. "The Northern Pacific Railway wants to build a spur line right through our valley," he announced. "This will put Timberline on the map. It means commerce, prosperity, a new future." A voice from the back called out, "Who's backing this project?" "A consortium of Eastern investors," Cole puffed, adjusting his collar, "led by a very distinguished gentleman from Boston. He'll be arriving next week to survey the route himself. A Mr. Augustine Kingsley." The name hit Sarah like a punch to the gut. Augustine Kingsley, William's older brother, the man who had stood in her drawing room in Boston, his face a mask of cold fury, and told her she was responsible for William's death. He'd said her silly romantic notions had sent his brother to war. His influence, his whispers, had turned all of Boston society against her, poisoning her life until she had no choice but to flee west. And now he was coming here. "Miss Abbott, are you all right?" Dr. Wilson was at her side, his face etched with concern. "Fine," she choked out, the room suddenly feeling hot and small. "Just the heat." He helped her outside into the cold November air. "What really disturbed you, Sarah?" he asked gently. It wasn't the stuffy room. She took a shaky breath. She needed an ally. "Augustine Kingsley was my fiancé's brother. We did not part on good terms." Understanding dawned in the doctor's eyes. "I see. Will his presence here be a problem?" "For me, most certainly," she said, "and possibly for Timberline." An idea, desperate and sudden, began to form in her mind. A way to avoid this confrontation. A way to finally get the answers she needed. "Doctor," she said, her voice firming, "perhaps it would be wise for me to be out of town during his visit. Would you happen to know if Dr. Blackwood might need some medical supplies delivered?" Dr. Wilson's eyebrows shot up. He studied her for a long moment. "Are you sure about this, Sarah? Ezra values his privacy above all else." "I'm not afraid of him, doctor." A small smile touched his lips. "No, I don't believe you are. That's why I'm agreeing. Ezra could use a friend who sees the man, not the monster." 2 days later, Sarah was on the trail to Ezra's cabin. A pack horse trailed behind her, laden with flour, coffee, and the medical supplies from Dr. Wilson. The sky was a low, bruised gray. Snow was coming. She was halfway there when the first flakes began to fall. Gentle at first, then thicker, faster. The wind picked up, a low growl that turned into a vicious snarl. It drove the snow sideways, a blinding white curtain that erased the world. Within minutes, the trail vanished. The temperature plummeted. Her horse stumbled on a hidden patch of ice. Sarah cried out as she was thrown from the saddle, landing hard in a deep snowdrift. A sharp, searing pain shot through her ankle. The horses, spooked, bolted a few yards away and stood watching her, their breath pluming in the frigid air. She tried to stand. The pain in her ankle was blinding. It buckled beneath her, and she collapsed back into the snow with a cry of agony. Not broken, she prayed, but badly sprained. The cold was already seeping in, a deep, numbing chill that stole the strength from her limbs. People died in Montana blizzards. They froze just yards from safety, lost in the swirling white chaos. She started to crawl. She had to reach the horses. Ignoring the pain, ignoring the numbness creeping into her fingers, she dragged herself through the snow. She was halfway there when a shadow detached itself from the storm. It was tall, broad, unmistakable. Ezra Blackwood moved through the blizzard like he was part of it. He reached her in seconds. Without a word, he scooped her up into his arms as if she weighed nothing. He let out a sharp whistle, and the horses trotted to him, docile as lambs. "Hold tight," he rumbled, his voice a vibration she felt deep in her chest. He lifted her onto his own horse, a massive black gelding, then swung up behind her. His body was a shield, protecting her from the worst of the wind. His warmth was a shocking, solid presence against her back. "My ankle," she managed to say, her teeth chattering. "I know," he said. "Don't talk. Save your warmth." He guided the horse through the raging storm with an uncanny sense of direction, even as the world disappeared around them. Sarah leaned back against him, surrendering to the exhaustion and the cold, trusting this giant of a man to save her. By the time the dark shape of the cabin emerged from the blizzard, she was shivering uncontrollably, on the edge of consciousness. He carried her inside, kicking the door shut against the storm, and the world she entered was not what she expected. It wasn't the filthy lair of a monster. It was beautiful. Bookshelves lined one wall, crammed with leather-bound volumes. A huge stone fireplace crackled with a roaring fire, casting a golden glow on polished wooden floors and colorful Cheyenne rugs. And against the far wall stood the piano, a magnificent chairing upright. He placed her gently in a chair by the fire. "Stay," he commanded, and then he was gone again, back out into the storm to see to the horses. Sarah stared around in wonder. Her gaze fell on a framed photograph on the mantel. It was a striking Cheyenne woman, with kind, intelligent eyes, standing beside a younger, clean-shaven Ezra in an army surgeon's uniform. They looked happy, in love. It must have been taken before the war, before everything broke. When he returned, covered in snow, she was looking at his medical texts. "Gray's Anatomy," she said, her voice hoarse. "First edition." Ezra paused, clearly surprised she recognized it. "Second," he corrected, moving to the fire. "The first had too many errors." "My father was a physician in Boston." She watched as he filled a kettle with water and hung it over the flames. "Thank you for finding me. I might have—" "You would have died," he stated, his voice flat and matter-of-fact. He knelt before her and with surprising gentleness removed her boot to examine her swollen ankle. "Sprained, not broken. You're lucky." "I don't think luck had anything to do with it," she replied. "How did you know I was on the trail?" His dark, guarded eyes met hers for a fleeting moment. "Wilson sent word." He began to wrap her ankle with a clean bandage from a medical bag. "Why did you come yourself? Why not send one of the town boys?" The directness of the question startled her. She could lie. She could make up an excuse. But something in his gaze demanded the truth. "Because I know you were there," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "At Gettysburg. I know you tried to save William Kingsley. I know you heard his last words." All the color drained from Ezra's face. He dropped the bandage and stood up, moving to the window to stare out at the white fury of the storm. His broad back was a wall of stone. "How?" he asked, his voice rough. "How could you possibly know that?" Sarah took a deep breath. This was it, the moment of truth. "Sometimes, when I touch things, I see. I see the past." She waited for him to call her a liar, a lunatic, to throw her back out into the blizzard. Instead, he slowly turned back to face her, his expression unreadable in the flickering firelight. "You touched my axe," he stated. It wasn't a question. She nodded, tears blurring her vision. "And I saw Gettysburg." He was silent for a long time, the only sound the howl of the wind and the crackle of the fire. "You're William," he finally said, his voice softer than she'd ever heard it. "He was a brave man. He asked me to tell you, not to blame yourself." "And that he would love me beyond the stars," she finished, the tears finally falling. "I heard him. Through you." Ezra looked away, a deep hidden pain surfacing in his eyes. "I never knew who Sarah was," he said quietly. "By the time the war was over, by the time I might have looked, my own life." He gestured vaguely at the cabin, at the isolation, at the mountains that had become his prison and his refuge. "I understand," she whispered, and in that moment, she truly did. The kettle began to whistle. Ezra moved to make tea, his large hands surprisingly deft. As he handed her a steaming cup, he spoke again, his voice carefully neutral. "The bread you've been leaving," he said. "It's good." It was his way of changing the subject, but it was more than that. It was an acknowledgement, an acceptance of their strange, silent connection, and it was a peace offering. "The carvings you left," she replied, her voice steadying, "they're beautiful. The hands need something to do in winter." He sat in a chair across from her, cradling his own cup. Then he looked at her, his gaze direct and piercing. "Why are you really here, Sarah Abbott? It's not just about William's message." She took a sip of tea. "Partly to avoid someone. A man from my past in Boston is arriving in town." "And partly," he pressed. She met his gaze without flinching. "And mostly, because I think we both know what it's like to be misunderstood." A flicker of something, surprise, respect, crossed his face. He looked out the window at the storm that was only getting worse. "The blizzard will last through tomorrow," he said. "You'll stay here. Take the bed. I'll sleep by the fire." "I couldn't possibly—" "You can, and you will," he interrupted, his tone leaving no room for argument. "Your ankle needs to be elevated. The floor is no place for healing." As darkness fell, the cabin became a tiny island of warmth and light in a raging sea of white. Ezra was a surprisingly thoughtful host. He made a simple stew for dinner, and they ate in a comfortable silence, broken only by the howl of the wind. After they ate, Sarah found herself drawn to the piano. Her fingers hovered over the keys. "May I?" she asked. Ezra just nodded from his chair by the fire, where he was reading a medical journal. She began to play, a simple Bach prelude at first, then something more complex. The piano was perfectly in tune, its rich voice filling the small cabin. When she finished, she glanced over at Ezra. He was no longer reading. He was watching her, his journal forgotten in his lap. "Moonlight Sonata," he requested, his voice quiet. She nodded, understanding. She began to play William's song. As the melancholy notes filled the room, she felt Ezra move to stand behind her. His presence was a solid, comforting weight at her back, a mountain protecting her from the storm. When the last note faded, he cleared his throat. "He spoke of you, you know, before Gettysburg. He called you the Boston girl with music in her soul and stars in her eyes." Tears pricked her eyes again. "William was a poet. He loved you very much." "Yes." She traced a pattern on the piano's polished wood. "His brother Augustine, he blamed me for William's death. He said I should have begged him to stay. He made my life in Boston impossible." Ezra's expression darkened. "Augustine Kingsley, the railroad investor." Sarah's head snapped up. "You know of him?" "I received a letter last week," Ezra said, his mouth twisting into a grim line. "The railroad wants my land. They want to put their tracks right through this valley, right through this cabin." A log shifted in the fireplace, sending a shower of sparks up the chimney. Outside, the wind shrieked. The man from her past, the monster who had driven her from her home, was coming to destroy the sanctuary of the man who had saved her. The two storms, one outside the cabin and one on its way, were about to collide, and she was standing right in the middle. The blizzard raged for 2 full days. Trapped in the cabin, Sarah and Ezra fell into an unexpected rhythm. He was quiet and reserved, but not unkind. He treated her ankle with a surgeon's skill, and by the second day, she could walk on it with the help of a walking stick he'd carved for her. She, in turn, brought a sense of order to his solitary life. She organized his cluttered medical supplies, cooked meals that filled the cabin with aromas it hadn't known in years, and filled the long hours with music from his piano. They talked, not about the past, not about William or Morning Star, but about books, philosophy, and the healing properties of the mountain herbs he collected. She discovered a brilliant, wounded mind hidden beneath his rough exterior. He, in turn, seemed to find a strange comfort in her presence, in the simple domesticity she brought to his silent home. One afternoon, while he was outside checking on his horses, she found a worn leather journal on a low shelf. Her gift, her curse, urged her to touch it, but she resisted. She would not invade his privacy. "You can read it, if you wish." His voice from the doorway startled her. He stood there, covered in snow, his expression unreadable. "I wouldn't," she said, pulling her hand back. "It's not a private journal." He crossed the room, took the book, and handed it to her. After Morning Star died, I began writing down the things her father taught me. Grey Wolf. He's a Cheyenne medicine man. This is his knowledge. Sarah opened the book reverently. The pages were filled with meticulous notes and detailed sketches of plants. It was a treasure. The Cheyenne trust me because of Morning Star, he explained. Their way of life is always disappearing. Their knowledge deserves to be preserved. From men like Augustine Kingsley, she murmured. From progress, he corrected, his voice laced with a bitter irony. On the third morning, the storm broke. The world outside was a pristine, dazzling white, sparkling under a brilliant blue sky. The trail to town will be passable by this afternoon, Ezra said over breakfast. He looked at her, his dark eyes searching hers. If you wish to return. Augustine would be in Timberline, waiting. The thought sent a jolt of fear through her, but it was a different kind of fear now. It wasn't the panicked terror of a cornered animal. It was the cold resolve of a soldier before a battle. My presence here might complicate things for you, she said, if he learns we're acquainted. My life is already complicated, he replied. A ghost of a smile touched his lips. And I find your company unburdensome. For Ezra, she knew this was a profound compliment. Later that morning, as he was preparing to check on Grey Wolf's camp in a nearby valley, he asked her a question that hung in the air between them. Your gift, he said, not looking at her. When you cook for people, you see their future. Sometimes just glimpses. Have you seen anything for me? The question was casual, but the tension in his broad shoulders told her it was anything but. No, she answered truthfully. Not beyond the past. Nothing. He seemed to accept this. We should check on Grey Wolf's people, he said, changing the subject. Storms like this are hard on the elders. I'd like you to come with me. My ankle. I've fashioned you a proper walking stick, he said, his tone making it clear the matter was settled. The journey was breathtaking. The snow-covered landscape was beautiful and treacherous. He led her along a path she never would have found on her own, deeper into the foothills. Grey Wolf's camp was hidden in a small sheltered valley. A cluster of teepees stood like silent sentinels, smoke curling from their peaks. An old man emerged to greet them. His hair was long and silver, his face a roadmap of a long and difficult life, but his eyes were sharp and clear. Grey Wolf, Ezra said, this is Sarah Abbott. She makes the medicine bread. The old man studied her with an unnerving intensity. The woman who speaks through food, he said in perfect English. My granddaughter said your bread carries dreams. Sarah glanced at Ezra, confused, but he gave nothing away. Inside Grey Wolf's teepee, they shared a fragrant herbal tea. A young girl sat silently beside the fire, watching Sarah with wide, curious eyes. Ezra introduced her as Cheyenne. She was Grey Wolf's granddaughter. Ezra says you have a gift, Grey Wolf said, his piercing gaze seeming to look right through her. You see things others cannot. Sometimes, she admitted, her voice small, and it frightens you. Yes. Gifts that set us apart always bring fear, the old man said wisely. The choice is whether to let fear rule the gift or let the gift transform the fear. As they prepared to leave, Grey Wolf gave her a small, beaded leather pouch. For your dreams, he said, place it under your pillow when you wish to see more clearly. On the walk back to the cabin, as the sun began to set, painting the snow in shades of pink and gold, Sarah felt a sense of peace she hadn't known was possible. The Cheyenne are your family, aren't they? She realized aloud. Yes, Ezra said, his voice quiet. After Morning Star died, they took me in when the town turned its back on me. They reached the cabin as the first stars appeared in the twilight sky. The peace was shattered by the sound of approaching horses. Ezra moved instantly, grabbing a rifle from its rack by the door. Stay inside, he commanded, his voice dropping into a low, dangerous growl. Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs as she peered through the window. 2 riders were making their way up the trail. As they drew closer, she recognized one of them. It's Dr. Wilson, she called out. Ezra lowered the rifle but didn't relax his stance. What's happened? Sarah asked as the doctor dismounted, his face grim in the moonlight. Augustine Kingsley, Wilson said, his breath fogging in the cold air. He knows you're here, Sarah, and he's not just asking questions, he's making accusations. What kind of accusations? Ezra demanded. He's telling Mayor Cole and anyone who will listen that you're mentally unstable, that you fled Boston after suffering delusions. He's saying you're a danger to the town. Sarah felt the blood drain from her face. He was using the same lies he'd used in Boston, but it was worse, so much worse. He's brought another doctor with him, Wilson said, his voice grave. A Dr. Hammond from the Boston Psychiatric Hospital. The man is known for his aggressive methods of treatment for female hysteria. He means to have me committed, Sarah whispered, the horror of it closing in on her. He means to take me back. I believe so, Wilson said grimly. And that's not all. He's organizing a delegation to ride out here tomorrow morning. The sheriff, the mayor, and some hired men. He's telling them it's to discuss the land purchase. But his real goal is to take you. The cabin, which had become a sanctuary, suddenly felt like a trap. I brought a second horse, Wilson said quickly. James here can guide you. There's a mining town, Kingston, 3 valleys over. The sheriff there owes me his life. You'd be safe. Flee. Run again. It was the same choice she'd faced in Boston, but this time was different. This time, she wasn't alone. Ezra looked at her, a silent question in his eyes. But before she could answer, he turned to Dr. Wilson. Give us a moment. Inside the cabin, Ezra moved with a swift, sudden urgency. He pulled a thick, fur-lined coat from a chest. You'll need this, he said, his voice tight. And food. The journey to Kingston is 3 days. She watched him packing a satchel for her, and a cold realization dawned. You're not coming with me. I can't, he said, his back to her. If we both disappear, Kingsley will know we were warned. He'll make trouble for Wilson. I have to stay. I have to face him. And what if he tries to take your land by force? What if he brings the authorities? Then I'll deal with it. The set of his jaw was like granite, but Sarah knew it was more than the land. She'd seen the Cheyenne camp. She'd seen the women and children. Gray Wolf's people, she said, the pieces clicking into place. If the railroad takes this land, they'll find the camp. Ezra turned to face her then, and the look in his eyes was bleak. The camp is home to several families who escaped the forced relocation years ago. They aren't registered. To the government, they don't exist. If they are found, he didn't have to finish. She knew what would happen. And in that moment, everything changed. The fear was still there, a cold knot in her stomach. But something else was rising to meet it, a hot, fierce anger. Then I'm not going, she said, her voice shaking but firm. I won't run. Not this time. Running will only make me look guilty. I will not abandon you, and I will not abandon them. She took a step closer to him, her chin high. We face him, together. Ezra studied her face, searching for any sign of doubt. He found none. A slow, reluctant nod was his only reply. When they went back outside, Dr. Wilson looked from one to the other, his expression worried. There's been a change of plan, Ezra announced. Sarah stays. That's suicide, Wilson protested. Kingsley has the whole town on his side. He has lies on his side, Sarah corrected. We have the truth, and there is more at stake here than you know. The doctor sighed, a sound of weary resignation. I suspected as much. He pulled Ezra aside, speaking in a low, urgent whisper. Sarah couldn't hear the words, but she saw Ezra's face harden, his eyes narrowing into dangerous slits. He gave Wilson a single, sharp nod. After the doctor rode off into the night, they returned to the cabin. The warmth inside felt different now, tense, expectant. What did he tell you? Sarah asked. Ezra bolted the heavy wooden door. Kingsley didn't just bring a doctor. He brought hired guns, mercenaries. Wilson overheard them talking about clearing obstacles from the railway line. Obstacles, Sarah repeated, her blood running cold. Like you, and Gray Wolf's people. It seems your Augustine hasn't changed, Ezra said, his voice flat. Force is still his only language. This is my fault, she whispered, sinking into a chair. If I hadn't come here, if you hadn't come here, Ezra cut her off, kneeling in front of her, his intensity a palpable force. I would be facing him alone and blind. But you know him, Sarah. You know his weaknesses. You know what he fears. She thought for a moment, seeing Augustine's cold, proud face in her mind. He fears public embarrassment, she said. Loss of face, loss of his precious family reputation. A strategic gleam entered Ezra's eyes. Then that's what we give him. He stood and went to his desk, grabbing a pen and paper. But first we have to warn Grey Wolf. His people need to move. Tonight. I'll go, Sarah said, standing up. You're needed here to prepare. I can find the trail. He looked at her, saw the steel in her spine, and nodded. Take my mare. She knows the way. He handed her the letter he'd quickly written. Tell Grey Wolf to trust no one. As she buttoned the heavy fur coat, he pressed the small beaded pouch into her hand, the one Grey Wolf had given her. For clear dreams, he said, his voice softer now. Their eyes met in the lamplight. It wasn't love. It wasn't friendship. It was something deeper. The unspoken bond of two soldiers preparing for a battle they knew they might not survive. Be careful, he murmured. And you, she replied. As she rode the big mare through the moonlit snow, Sarah Abbott felt the last of her old self fall away. The frightened Boston girl was gone. In her place was a woman who had found something to fight for. Augustine Kingsley was coming to take her freedom in Ezra's land. He was coming with laws and lies and hired guns. But he was going to find something waiting for him that he never could have expected. A monster in the woman who wasn't afraid of him. Tomorrow the storm would arrive, and she would be ready. Sarah returned just as the first hint of gray lightened the eastern sky. The air was frigid, her breath a cloud in front of her face. Ezra was waiting on the porch, a dark, silent sentinel. Grey Wolf is moving the women and children, she said as he took the mare's reins. He and the warriors are staying. He said, a chief does not abandon his land to threats. Ezra nodded, a grim look on his face. I expected as much. In the warmth of the cabin, exhaustion hit her like a physical blow. You need to rest, Ezra said. Kingsley won't be here before noon. We need a plan, she insisted, pouring a cup of coffee with a trembling hand. The plan is already in motion, he replied. Wilson is telegraphing colleagues in Boston. He's digging into Dr. Hammond's past. If we can discredit the doctor, we discredit Augustine's claims about you. And if he can't find anything, then we discredit the myths about me. He gestured to a stack of papers on his desk. Testimonials from every person I've treated over the years. Proof of my work, my sanity. She understood. They would fight Augustine's lies with an avalanche of truth. She must have slept, because when she opened her eyes, bright sunlight was streaming through the window. She sat up with a jolt. They're here. Ezra's voice was calm, but his body was coiled like a spring. He stood at the window, watching the group of riders make their way up the snowy trail. There were at least 8 of them. At the front was Augustine Kingsley, his expensive coat and arrogant posture a jarring sight in the rugged wilderness. Beside him rode Mayor Cole and the sheriff, both looking deeply uncomfortable. Behind them was the thin, weaselly-looking man she assumed was Dr. Hammond, and 4 rough-looking men with rifles slung across their saddles. The hired guns. Sarah took a deep, steadying breath. She felt Ezra's solid presence beside her. They stepped out onto the porch together, a silent, united front. Augustine pulled his horse to a halt, his eyes widening in surprise when he saw them standing together. He recovered quickly, swinging down from his saddle with practiced elegance. Sarah, he called out, his voice dripping with false concern. Thank heavens. We were so worried. Were you, Augustine? She replied, her voice as cold and clear as the mountain air. How kind. He strode toward the porch, his expensive boots crunching in the snow. When we learned you had come to this place, we naturally feared for your safety. As you can see, she said, gesturing to Ezra, I'm perfectly safe. Dr. Blackwood has been a most gracious host. Augustine's gaze slid to Ezra, a look of undisguised contempt on his face. Dr. Blackwood, is it? I was under the impression you were some kind of savage. I was chief surgeon for the 7th Massachusetts Infantry, Ezra replied, his deep voice carrying an authority that made Augustine flinch. I studied at Harvard. The shot hit its mark. Augustine was visibly thrown, but he quickly regained his composure. He introduced Dr. Hammond, who peered at Sarah through his wire-rimmed spectacles like she was a bug under a microscope. Miss Abbott, he said, his voice thin and reedy, your history of episodes following your fiancé's death is well documented. Such delusions often worsen under the strain of isolation. I experience grief, doctor, Sarah snapped, her patience gone. Not delusions. Now, what is the real purpose of this visit? Augustine sighed dramatically. Very well. We are here to discuss the railroad's purchase of this land, and, he added, his eyes locking on hers, my personal concern for your welfare. The threat was clear. Cooperate or be declared insane. Let's continue this inside, Mayor Cole suggested nervously, glancing at the sky. Ezra nodded. They had planned for this. Better to fight on their own ground. He allowed Augustine, Cole, and Hammond inside. The hired guns were told to wait in the barn. The inside of the cabin was another shock to Augustine. The books, the piano, the civilized warmth, it all contradicted the narrative of the savage mountain man he had clearly been spinning. To business, Augustine said, dispensing with any further pleasantries. The railroad offers you 3 times the value of this property, Blackwood. The land is not for sale, Ezra stated simply. Every man has his price. This is more than land, Ezra said, his voice low and steady. It is a sanctuary, a buffer between 2 worlds. Augustine sneered. You mean between the town and the Indians you're illegally harboring? There it was, the knife unsheathed. I treat all who need medical care, Ezra said, his voice dangerously calm, as I swore an oath to do. A noble sentiment, Augustine mocked, but harboring fugitives is a federal crime, just as living unchaperoned with a man of questionable repute is a death sentence for a woman's reputation. The insult was meant to provoke, to shatter their calm. But before Sarah could respond, the cabin door burst open. Dr. Wilson stood there, breathless, waving a handful of papers. I'm not here to talk, he announced, his eyes blazing. I'm here with telegrams from Boston, about Dr. Hammond. Hammond's face went pale. Did you know, Mayor, Wilson said, his voice ringing with triumph, that Dr. Hammond was dismissed from Massachusetts General for malpractice that resulted in a patient's death? Or that the Boston Psychiatric Hospital revoked his privileges last year for unethical and fatal experimental treatments? These are lies, Hammond shrieked. The Medical Society keeps records, Doctor, Wilson countered. Records that can't be bought off with Kingsley money. Augustine lunged for the papers, his mask of civility finally cracking. This is slander. It's the truth, Wilson shot back. 3 women died under his progressive care, all of them diagnosed with so-called female hysteria, the same diagnosis he was preparing to give to Sarah. The room fell silent. Mayor Cole stared at Augustine, his face a mixture of shock and dawning horror. But just as Sarah felt a surge of victory, a new sound came from outside. A shout, a man's voice raised in alarm. Riders coming! Indians! Augustine spun on Ezra, his face contorted with rage. This was a trap. Not a trap, Ezra said calmly, moving toward the door. A meeting. Through the window, Sarah saw them. Grey Wolf riding tall and proud, flanked by 4 of his best warriors. They moved with a silent, deadly grace, halting their horses a stone's throw from the cabin. The tension outside was a powder keg. Augustine's hired guns had their rifles out, aimed at the Cheyenne. The Cheyenne sat on their horses motionless, their hands resting on their own weapons. Everyone spilled out of the cabin onto the porch. You are the one they call Kingsley, Grey Wolf said, his voice carrying the weight of ages. He spoke to Augustine, but his eyes missed nothing. This land belongs to the railroad, Augustine blustered. This land belongs to the spirits of my ancestors, Grey Wolf replied, his voice calm but unyielding. The route you have chosen for your iron road passes through our most sacred burial ground, a place where our grandfathers are laid to rest. That's irrelevant under property law, Augustine sneered. Is it irrelevant? Ezra asked, his voice dangerously quiet. That desecrating that ground would be seen as an act of war by every Cheyenne tribe in this territory? The threat hung in the air, heavy and real. A war you would lose, Augustine shot back. Perhaps, Ezra conceded, but the story of a wealthy Boston family destroying a sacred Indian burial ground for profit would make for very interesting reading in the Eastern newspapers. Especially, he added, glancing at Sarah, when told by a woman they had tried to silence by falsely committing her to an asylum. Sarah saw it then, the flicker of fear in Augustine's eyes. He wasn't afraid of the Cheyenne. He wasn't afraid of Ezra. He was afraid of scandal. He was afraid of his name being dragged through the mud. Mayor Cole, seeing a chance to defuse the situation, spoke up. Mr. Kingsley, perhaps there's an alternative route. He was cut off by a sudden commotion. One of the hired gun's horses spooked, rearing and plunging. In the chaos, the man's rifle went off. The shot echoed through the valley like the crack of doom. Instantly, all hell broke loose. Guns were drawn. Arrows were nocked. A Cheyenne warrior, a young man with fire in his eyes, urged his horse forward, his rifle coming up, its barrel aimed directly at Augustine Kingsley's heart. Time froze. "Hold!" Ezra's voice was a roar of command. He stepped off the porch, placing his massive body directly between the young warrior and Augustine. "Swift Fox," he said in the Cheyenne tongue, "lower your weapon." The warrior, Swift Fox, hesitated, his knuckles white on the rifle. "This man's family is soaked in the blood of our people," he snarled in broken English. "His father was Captain Kingsley, the butcher of the Washita River." A new, sickening truth fell into place. The massacre at the Washita, a peaceful Cheyenne village, slaughtered in their sleep, led by Augustine's own father. "I am not my father," Augustine cried, his voice shrill with terror. "Yet you would have me answer for mine?" Ezra countered softly. "And Sarah for her grief? And Grey Wolf for his people's survival?" Grey Wolf spoke then, his voice cutting through the tension. "Swift Fox, vengeance will not bring your father back. It will only bring more soldiers, more death." With a cry of rage and anguish, the young warrior slowly, reluctantly, lowered his rifle. The standoff was over. But the battle was not. In the aftermath, the negotiations were different. Shaken and exposed, Augustine Kingsley was a changed man. He looked at the map Ezra had prepared, showing an alternative route for the railroad, one that skirted both Ezra's land and the sacred burial grounds. He agreed. By sunset, a preliminary agreement was signed. The land was safe. The Cheyenne were safe. As Augustine prepared to leave, he approached Sarah on the porch. He looked older, diminished. "William would have been proud of you," he said, the words costing him dearly. "Then let him rest in peace, Augustine," she said softly. He looked away, toward the mountains, and for the first time, she saw not a monster, but a man broken by a grief he didn't know how to carry. "I promised my mother I would keep him safe," he whispered, the confession raw and painful. "When he died, it felt like my failure, and someone had to be blamed." He finally met her eyes. "I was wrong to put that burden on you." He mounted his horse and rode away, taking the ghosts of Boston with him. Sarah was left standing on the porch beside the giant, who was no longer a monster, watching the sun set over the land that was finally truly their home. But the story doesn't end there, because what happened next was something no one in Timberline could have ever predicted. With the threat of the railroad gone, an uneasy peace settled over the valley. Sarah moved her things from the bakery to Ezra's cabin, and the whispers in town slowly began to change. Fear gave way to a grudging respect, then to outright curiosity. Dr. Wilson began referring his most difficult cases to the mountain doctor, and Ezra, with Sarah at his side, started practicing medicine again, blending his surgical skill with the herbal knowledge of the Cheyenne. Their cabin became a clinic, a place of healing that stood as a bridge between two worlds. They were married in the spring, in a simple ceremony on the porch, with Grey Wolf and Dr. Wilson officiating together. Margaret Wilkins baked the cake. The entire town, it seemed, turned out to witness the union of the giant and the baker, the two outcasts who had saved them all. But Sarah's gift was not finished with her. One evening, while preparing dinner, she was chopping vegetables when she gripped the handle of a knife Ezra had forged himself. The vision that hit her was the most powerful, the most terrifying she had ever had. It wasn't the past. It was the future. She saw fire, a forest fire, raging through the valley, sweeping down from the high peaks. She saw the town of Timberline burning, houses turning to ash. She saw Grey Wolf's camp consumed by the flames, and she saw Ezra, standing in the heart of the inferno, his face a mask of agony, as the roof of their cabin collapsed on top of him. She screamed, dropping the knife, stumbling back, the vision searing itself onto her mind. "Sarah, what is it? What did you see?" Ezra was at her side in an instant, his hands on her shoulders. "Fire," she gasped, her body trembling uncontrollably. "A fire is coming. It will destroy everything. It will kill you." He held her, his expression grim. He didn't doubt her. Not for a second. "When?" "I don't know," she cried. "Soon. The trees are dry. The air feels wrong." For the next week, they lived under a cloud of dread. Ezra organized fire brigades in town and at the Cheyenne camp. They cleared brush, dug fire breaks, and set up watch posts on the high ridges. The whole valley prepared for a disaster that only Sarah had seen. Some in the town called her a prophet. Others called her a madwoman. Then one hot, windy afternoon, the lookout rider came galloping down from the mountains, his face pale with panic. "Smoke!" he yelled. "On the north ridge! It's moving fast!" The fire was exactly where Sarah had seen it in her vision. It was real. The firestorm that descended on the valley was a living entity, a ravenous beast of flame and smoke. It moved faster than any man could run, devouring the dry forest with a deafening roar. The sky turned a sickening orange-black, and ash rained down like snow. The town of Timberline was directly in its path. "We have to evacuate," the sheriff yelled over the roar. "To the river! It's the only chance!" But Sarah knew. The river wouldn't be enough. The fire in her vision was too big, too hot. It would jump the water. "No!" she shouted. "Not the river! The old quarry! The stone walls will protect us." "That's miles away," the sheriff argued. "We'll never make it." "We have to try." Ezra's voice boomed, rallying the panicked townspeople. "Trust her. She has seen the way." It was a desperate gamble. A chaotic exodus began, a stream of wagons and people fleeing the approaching inferno, heading not for the safety of the river, but for the abandoned stone quarry on the far side of the valley. Sarah and Ezra stayed behind, working with Grey Wolf's warriors to help the last of the families escape. The fire was closing in. The heat was becoming unbearable. "We have to go!" Ezra yelled, grabbing her arm. But as they turned to flee, a burning tree crashed down across the trail, blocking their path. They were trapped. The main fire front was roaring towards them. "The cabin!" Ezra shouted, pulling her toward their home. "The root cellar! It's our only hope!" They scrambled down the ladder into the dark, earthy cellar, just as the first wave of fire hit the cabin above. The sound was like a freight train, a terrifying, all-consuming roar. The air grew thick and hot, and the wooden timbers above them began to groan and crack. This was it, the vision. It was coming true. Huddled in the darkness, Sarah clutched Ezra's hand. "I saw this," she whispered, her voice choked with smoke and tears. "I saw you die." "The future is not written in stone, Sarah," he said, his voice a calm anchor in the chaos. "You saw one path, but your warning gave us another." The cabin above them exploded in a shower of flame and splintered wood. The cellar door, their only protection, began to smoke and char. The heat was becoming unlivable. They were being baked alive. Just when Sarah thought she couldn't take another breath, she felt a strange shift, a new current in the air. The wind, it was changing direction. Slowly, miraculously, the roar of the fire began to recede. The suffocating heat lessened. After what felt like an eternity, a profound silence fell, broken only by the crackle of smoldering ruins. They waited. An hour. 2. Finally, Ezra pushed against the charred remains of the cellar door. It crumbled to ash, opening a view to a smoke-filled, apocalyptic sky. They climbed out into a changed world. The landscape was a blackened, smoking ruin. The forest was gone. Their cabin was a pile of smoldering timbers. But beyond, in the distance, they could see the stone walls of the quarry. And huddled inside, safe and alive, were the people of Timberline and the Cheyenne. She had saved them. Her gift, the burden she had carried for so long, had saved them all. In the weeks that followed, they began to rebuild. The two communities, forged together by the fire, worked side by side, raising new homes from the ashes. A new town was born, one built not on suspicion and fear, but on shared survival and mutual respect. They called it Hope Station. One day a letter arrived from Boston. It was from Augustine Kingsley. He had heard about the fire and the miraculous survival of the town. He wrote that his work on the Senate Committee for Indian Affairs had changed him. He was using his influence to advocate for fair treaties and better conditions on the reservations. He ended the letter with a single stunning sentence. William's last will and testament left his entire inheritance not to me, but to you, Sarah. I have held it in trust. It is my hope that you will use it to rebuild the future he always believed you would create. The fortune that came with the letter was staggering, enough to build a proper school, a real hospital, a new life, not just for them, but for everyone in the valley. Years later, an old man stood on the platform of the bustling Hope Station train depot. Senator Augustine Kingsley looked out at the thriving town, at the school where Cheyenne and white children learned together, at the clinic with the sign that read, Blackwood and Blackwood Physicians. A young woman with dark, intelligent eyes and her mother's auburn hair approached him. She was followed by a young boy, his hand held firmly in hers. Uncle Augustine, the woman said with a smile. Welcome home. Augustine looked at his great niece Cheyenne, the first Cheyenne woman to graduate from a medical college back east. He looked at his great-nephew William, named for the brother he had finally learned to mourn. And on the porch of the large, beautiful house that had been built where the old cabin once stood, he saw them. Sarah and Ezra, older now, their hair touched with silver, but their bond as strong and solid as the mountains that cradled their home. Sarah was no longer the frightened girl who ran from ghosts, and Ezra was no longer the monster of the mountain. They were the architects of a new world, one built from the ashes of the old. They had faced down greed, hatred, and even the fury of nature itself. They had taken their burdens, their gifts, and their pain, and they had forged them into a legacy of hope. A love story written not in the stars, but carved into the very heart of the wild Montana frontier. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like and subscribe, because you never know what secrets are hiding just beyond the edge of town.